So we're joined by the one and only Vijay Prashad, who is the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay, so the first question that I have for you is a burning question that's on everyone's mind. What is a tanky?
Oh, well, I see. What is a tanky? It's great to be with you. This is one of my favorite podcasts. It's not a tanky podcast. I don't even know really why we would play with the term. The term has a funny origin, and I actually hadn't heard this term in many, many years. It made a return just a few years ago, I think, when a certain section of particularly in the West, a certain section of social media opinion started to attack people who seemed to be in favor of the Cuban Revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela, people who were with Evo Morales at the time when the coup was happening. People like that, that is to say, people like you and I, began to be called tankies. This is a term that comes from 1956. Certainly before you were born, and yes, even before I was born. That's when Soviet tanks entered Hungary. And the question lay before the international left in 1956, do you support the Soviet intervention or not? Those who supported the Soviet intervention were disparagingly called tankies. Now, if you know anything about 1956 and if you know anything about Hungary, you might want to reconsider not supporting the Soviet intervention, because that was one of the most fascistic countries, perhaps had a society more fascistic than Nazi Germany. And so, the whatever socialist project was at work in Hungary in 1956 was being threatened not by liberalism or democracy, but by fascism. It's a very different situation in 1968 when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia. Then it was a question of reform, more liberal reform. It was not fascism. But 1956, pretty straightforward situation. That term, tanky, those who support the Soviet tanks entering Hungary, was resurrected, it seems to me, just in the last few years. And it's a creature of social media. I mean, I have never in my life actually been called a tanky to my face. But I do regularly get called tanky, especially on Twitter. This is more a Twitter phenomena, where people have all kinds of pseudonyms, and half the people who seem to call me tanky have accounts that, to my mind, seem like CIA bot accounts. But how am I supposed to know? I haven't read the internal documents from Twitter. I have seen the leaked document from Facebook, which confirms that there's an enormous number of Miami-based troll armies that have been managing accounts regarding Honduras, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on. Yes, we know they're on Facebook. They must be on Twitter, and they're the ones who call you a tanky.
Well, I also find it just fascinating because it came out in a time when the fact is that the people with the tanks and the guns were actually supporting the coup, and those who didn't have the tanks and didn't have the guns were against a coup, specifically against, Evo Morales. But in other places, like, the Honduran elections are underway as we talk right now, and we know that the United States backed a military coup there. We know that the United States has backed, several coup attempts in places like Venezuela. I mean, you wrote a book about this. And so in reality, when they're saying tanky, I would just find it funny because it's like, who has the tanks and who has the bullets? It's definitely not the people who are struggling for, social democracy or struggling for socialism. It's definitely the people in the imperialist core who are, repeating CIA talking points, who those talking points aren't innocent, but they are often betrust by the barrel of, a tank gun or the barrel of a gun itself. And so I always just find that really fascinating. It's the people with no power, so to speak, in terms of military force who are being relabeled. It's the colonial turn, it's like all of a sudden self-defense looks, like violence or becomes aggression. And then invasion itself or colonialism becomes a form of self-defense. So I always find that like a very bizarre term, but it does have this historical origin, which I think is important. I want to turn to just before we get into the broader interview about the Indian farmer protests and the historic victory that they made recently. I want to talk a little bit about COP26 and the state of the environmental movement, but also where the left comes in. You were recently the chief judge, I believe, on a tribunal at COP26. Can you talk a little bit about the meaning of COP26, its uselessness, but also its usefulness in terms of envisioning a kind of left socialist project in this era of climate chaos?
See, COP is the conference of parties, and they are the conference of parties of people who signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is COP26. It means for the 26th year, the conference of parties has been held. That means for a quarter of a century, governments have been debating what to do, in fact, what not to do, to basically help us not get a planet on fire. But COP also has its roots not only in climate change, but also environment. It's important to talk about that. It has its roots also in the Rio Conference on Environment and Development in 1992. It's at that conference that there was, I think, for the first time, quite universal acknowledgement that capitalism has really destroyed the environment and the land. Rio 1992 took place 20 years after the Stockholm Conference on the Environment. It's interesting, Nick, the first major UN conference on the environment was in 1972, as late as that. And also as far back as that. It's both. It didn't happen in the 40s and 50s. We already had devastation of land. And devastation of land happens in two ways. One is dispossession of people from the land, and the other is the deterioration of the quality of the land by industrial farming, utilization of chemicals, nuclear tests, for instance, and dumping of waste into the oceans and so on. But also dispossession of people. I mean, look, from the origin story of capitalism, this is to say, if you consider the massive genocide in the New World, so-called New World, of millions of people dispossessed, killed, and so on. Then even in Europe, mass dispossession of peasants who were then sent off to the Americas, sent off to Australia to commit their own genocides, secondary genocides as it were. So there were two ways in which the environment was destroyed, one through dispossession, the other through the quality of the earth and soil and water being grievously damaged. This produced a consciousness that one had to be aware of environmental damage. And when the evidence suggested first, the evidence first suggested that there was a hole in the ozone layer. And there was a big thing about don't use, aerosol and so on. It's going to damage that actually started to increase public consciousness about climate change. And eventually when the science became clear that global warming was a real issue and so on, this process began. And let's be clear that all the science has shown us that the Western countries, and that is to say the major capitalist countries, have basically utilized the carbon budget for the whole planet. Okay, since 1790s to the present, it's the United States, Northern Europe, and so on that have dominated the destruction of the planet. Let's be clear about that. And so that is now all established. There is a factual basis for all that. That's all in UN reports, in the intergovernmental, reports that have come out. The IPCC reports lay this out. It's not, our analysis. This is now a consensus that the West has produced the most damage in the planet. Now the question comes, how do we do things? We have to first stop the global rise of temperature, and we have to make sure the techniques to stop the global rise in temperature don't also halt the social development of people, poor people who don't have access to electricity, don't have access to food, education, and so on. So these are two competing motives. You got to first slow down the destruction of the planet, but also make sure this is not coming at the cost of the poor people who don't have access to things. And I think this is the heart of the debate. at the COP, because the Western countries are thinking of it in a different way. You see, they are basically saying that it's China and India to blame, and therefore China and India should stop their social development. And they are using the climate catastrophe to take public funds and deliver them to private companies so they can modernize capitalism. That's how the main powers are using COP. They're not really thinking about how to save the planet or how to make sure every 2.5 billion people who are not able to eat can eat. That's not on the agenda. What's on the agenda is how to get public money to private companies to modernize capitalism, and how to make sure that everybody thinks China and India are to blame. That was the heart of the COP26, okay? The real issue, which is the climate is really in bad shape, the planet is in really bad shape, and that humanity is struggling. We're struggling somewhere between extinction and annihilation. That's where we are, and they are only thinking about how to modernize capitalism. It's a really terrible situation.
Yeah, and one thing that I find quite remarkable as well is, there was a lot of conversation around the way that the very companies, the very corporations that were responsible, or that are most responsible for climate change and the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, have a seat at the table. One institution that was exempt from any kind of negotiations or limitations on their emissions or their role is the U.S. military. And the U.S. military emits greenhouse gases equivalent to 140 nations in the world. And, it's one thing to talk about the military power and the role that it plays and just the emissions. But on the other hand, I think, and this is something that I've learned quite well from reading the Tricontinental newsletters as well as reading your work, is thinking about how, U.S. power operates through a sanctions regime. That it's sanctioned. The United States is sanctioning about a third of humanity in these various global South nations, but also more developed nations as well. But that prevents the social development of these countries to achieve a point where they can transition away or to have a sort of more ethical relationship with the environment and to do more environmentally sustainable things. Can you talk a little bit about that as well? Because I feel like, there's several conversations happening, but people don't really, on the left, there's a moral issue about, kind of the humanitarian effects of sanctions. But then there's the larger, question about whether or not these countries like Venezuela, for example, there is an eco-socialist movement in Venezuela. And I would say that they have some of those ideas at the state, but they've been forced to entertain them more because their oil reserves are being sanctioned, they're being blocked from production. There's active sabotage, but nobody talks about the fact that 80% of the electricity from Venezuela comes from hydroelectric power. I'm not saying that's green energy, but it's not carbon emissions, and it's not greenhouse gas emissions.
During the special period in Cuba, Cuba was not able to get access to chemical fertilizers and to chemical pesticides. I remember my old friend Richard Levins, a great friend of Cuba, a great friend of the Cuban Revolution, professor at Harvard School of Public Health. Dick Levins, used to talk a lot about how during the special period, the Cuban farmers, the Cuban government had to innovate. They had to use multi-cropping. They had to use flowers as a deterrent to certain kinds of pests, for food crops and so on. So intermix, food crops with flowers, sunflowers and other things, basically to deter pests from coming in, because pests will get confused when they came in. And they had to be very innovative and therefore agroecological, organic in their farming. And it improved the food quality in Cuba. Problem for Cuba is that it can't get access to basic resources to help advance some of these ideas further. Let's be fair. Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution inherits a country that is reliant on selling oil. It's not like the Bolivarian Revolution said, let's go start drilling oil and make money. This is the country they inherited. Now they have to transition out of that. It's hard to transition out of something where over 85% of your external revenues comes from selling hydrocarbons. It's very difficult to transition out of that. It's a practical problem. But I think that the sanctions regime has forced a government in Venezuela to be extremely innovative. I mean, frankly, as you know, and as you just said, the Venezuelan government is committed to eco-socialism. They have a ministry of eco-socialism. The question is, how do you do it? You have to access certain kinds of technology that the sanctions are preventing from entering. High quality solar energy, for instance, systems. Very difficult to get it into the country. There's some attempt now from China, which is the world's largest producer of solar energy. And yes, Venezuela is reliant on hydroelectricity. Again, people may have problems. Frankly, every energy source produces problems because you're taking from the earth. It's hard to have a balanced relationship with the earth in a modern society. Just being completely frank, it's very difficult to do that. Because you're taking something from the earth, you're damming waters, you're creating high pressure lakes where it has to be high pressure because water has to come at a high pressure to move the turbines and so on. This creates all kinds of fissures, might have tendency in earthquake, could damage fish, the patterns of fish movement and so on. There's always going to be a problem whatever you do. You build a wind farm, you'll disturb the birds. They're always going to have some problem. I know that I was having a discussion with somebody about massive solar arrays. That is also very disturbing for bird flight patterns and so on. Huge reflection, things that birds get completely confused by. They'll get used to it over time. But nonetheless, you're always going to damage something. You use solar arrays, Nick, you're going to have batteries. You're going to have batteries. You're going to have to get the components from Bolivia, from Chile, from the Congo, and so on. And you know what those minerals and metals produce. They also produce military coups and so on. So there are problems. Now, sanctions regime prevents creativity. But I also, like you, as you said, I also want to say that it also sparks a kind of creativity. And here, let's just celebrate human ingenuity. In the middle of worst period in Venezuela, the people, the various communas, missions, and so on have been so creative in trying to grow food in the middle of the city, and that too not again pesticide, fertilizers, food systems, but to grow agroecologically. They are committed to agroecological food, but also they don't have access to fertilizers and pesticides at scale. So the sanctions enables also creativity. I must say though, I don't want to put this point too firmly because in the medical side, in the healthcare side, it's very hard to be creative. I mean, you really do need access to certain kinds of medications and so on. You well remember when the Venezuelan government was trying to buy vaccines from COVAX. UBS, the Swiss bank, essentially didn't allow Venezuela to make payments because of the sanctions. I'll just give you another quick example. The Chinese billionaire Jack Ma, he chartered a plane to send masks and sanitizer to Cuba. The plane refused to fly because one of the owners of this Colombian charter flight is in the United States, and they just wouldn't do it. I mean, sanctions in the medical field, there is really, you can't say that there's a net benefit. I mean, look, Cuba is the smallest country in the world to produce 5 vaccines for COVID-19. It's incredible. But Cuba is really an outlier, in all of this. Iran, under immense sanctions, has had a huge medical and health crisis. Very hard to innovate around health. Much easier, I think, not much easier, but it is easier to innovate in the field of agriculture. And we've seen this in Cuba, we've seen this in Venezuela and so on.
Yeah, and just to be clear, those hydroelectric dams that were built in Venezuela were built in the 60s and the 70s. And so again, the Bolivarian government revolution didn't make these dams, they inherited that. And it's also worth pointing out that the gas wars that happened in Bolivia in the early 2000s were over nationalizing gas reserves that were dominated by Western multinationals. You know, it was being exported and they were losing the value of reselling it on the global market. And so they wanted to that was the attempt. That's what helped bring Evo Morales and the movement towards socialism to power. And had it not been for that movement to nationalize the gas reserves, we wouldn't have had perhaps one of the 21st century's most revolutionary eco-socialist documents to emerge from the People's Accords in Cochabamba in 2010. And, you know, it's worth pointing out that this is, you know, a decade out. And we've, you know, the North likes to produce all these great ideas. And I would say that even things like the Green New Deal aren't as visionary and far-reaching and, you know, holistic as something like the People's Accords, which talks not just about the kind of material consumption as a measure of success, but one that there's sort of an intangible value to it, which is the fact of living well and living with dignity. But to live well and to live with dignity, you have to have basic needs met. And so there's you know, as you said before, there's this kind of competing vision of like, as if consumption or overconsumption is the problem, when in fact the vast majority of people underconsume. It's not a consumption issue so much for the vast majority of the world as it might be in places like, you know, the global North, where there's an attempt to maintain levels of consumption through further extraction and to, you know, get these green renewables just so that, you know, places like Minneapolis or wherever can continue to consume the same amounts of energy. And so I think that's an important point to make, is that it's not just about consumption as a measure of success when there's conversations about a just transition, but it's also talking about living a dignified life, which, you know, we have so much to learn in the North about what that actually means. I want to turn to India for a second, and for the remainder of this conversation, because there was a absolutely historic movement that recently gained, you know, a major victory. And I don't think I think like the New York Times was forced to acknowledge these kinds of things. Western media was forced to acknowledge these things, but this was considered the largest peaceful democratic protest the world has ever seen in years, you know. And certainly it was greatly organized at the height of the pandemic in a country that was, you know, devastated by COVID-19, but nonetheless has achieved and has, you know, counted coup, so to speak, on the Modi government and, you know, right-wing authoritarianism in India. Can you talk about how this movement arose and what it was battling against?
It's a long story, and I don't want to take up, you know, too much time, because there's a story that goes back to 1991, and then there's a story that starts in 2013. I have to give you a little of both stories. The first thing I'd like to say is that hundreds of thousands of farmers were at an encampment outside Delhi for a year, and they have refused to move. They faced massive police harassment and attacks. They faced attacks in the media. They were called terrorists. They were called anti-national and so on. But they withstood all that pressure, refused to move, refused to be divided. The government tried to divide them, tried to call some leaders in and so on. They refused all that. And they fought and fought and fought and forced this government to actually back down. The immediate issue was the passage last year in September of 3 farm bills. When those became law, they became law with almost no discussion. That provoked this protest. Now, the Modi government in 7 years, since 2013, has only twice backed down on anything. Only twice. First was in 2015 over the amendment to the Land Acquisition Act. There was again a big farmers' protest. They withdrew. And this time over these 3 farm laws. What the farmers objected to in this immediate laws was that this was going to Uberize farming. You were going to make farmers like Uber drivers. And, you know, the situation of Uber drivers is well known to people. You have absolutely no control over the situation. The apps dominate. It's a highly abstract domination because you can't even call Uber and say, hey, listen, I'm a driver, I've got a problem. I mean, you're basically a so-called freelance operator who's working at the mercy of the app. And they wanted to convert the marketplace into a digital marketplace, which would be like the Uber app. I mean, if you want an analogy, this is it. And the farmers said farming can't work like this. So they were able to get the Modi government to back off. Modi didn't say that the bill was wrong. He just said we failed to persuade you, which means they're going to come back with a new bill. Don't miss this. He just said we failed to persuade you. They're going to come back. So this is not over, and the farmers have not left their encampments because they have another demand, which is a much deeper demand. And that's for minimum support pricing, that's for electricity subsidies, that's even for a better education policy and so on. But let's stay with minimum support prices and electricity subsidies. You see, farming, as every farmer knows, is a deeply difficult profession to do under the conditions of capitalism. In the United States, farmers found this in the 1980s. There was a range of farm suicides. In the 1980s, that's when Willie Nelson starts Farm Aid to raise money to prevent foreclosures of farms and so on. Small and medium farmers, Nick, cannot do farming because you are under the vagaries of the market and of nature. Hey, listen, nature is hard enough to deal with, okay? If you got a bad crop one year because of drought or because there was too much rain, you can get wiped out. Nature is not necessarily a farmer's friend. It can go in all directions because it's got its own deal, okay? Nature isn't sitting there saying, how do I help humans? It's doing its own thing. And climate change doesn't help, okay? It's created extreme weather patterns and so on. So farming is difficult anyway, because it's hard to deal with the vagaries of nature. You add capitalism to it, it's hard. You add financialization, it's even harder. In other words, you start betting on future produce. You make farm futures like they do at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or they do in India. You create a kind of insanity of prices. Prices are out of sync with the actual work of the farmer. Prices become set by, speculators and so on. This is appalling for farmers. And so in India, from 1947, when the government was independent, till 1991, the government actually had a regulatory framework and an interventionist policy. It would come out there and set minimum support prices. It would also buy grain and other foodstuffs from the farmers and then sell it at cut price ration shops to the citizenry. So the state did two things. It helped farmers earn an income and it enabled people, particularly in cities, to buy affordable food. So farming and hunger could be dealt with by state policy. There's no other way to do it, frankly, Nick. That's a very rational way. 1991, under pressure from the International Monetary Fund, the state basically took away subsidy regimes, electricity subsidy, water subsidy, seed subsidy and all that stuff. And also started to whittle away minimum support prices. From 1991 till just a few months ago, as far as we have statistics, 400,000 Indian farmers committed suicide. In the past 7 years, 100,000 farmers committed suicide. These numbers are low because many places don't count women's suicides as farmer suicides. So the numbers are likely higher. 400,000 people in India have committed suicide, Nick, because of the farming crisis. So the farmers say, yes, take back the 3 laws, but we want the conditions of suicide to be removed. And that is why this struggle is not over. And also, it's why the Indian farmers are not just fighting for India. They are fighting for farmers everywhere. And I hope we come to realize that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's also worth maybe discussing a little bit about the social climate that led to these and the repression that happened. Because, this is a specific region, as I understand it. A lot of them are coming from, they're Punjabi, but also they're Sikh as well. I believe you're Sikh. I don't want to impose anything on, or at least your mother was, the last time we discussed that. But Like, what role do those kind of social forces play in this mobilization? I mean, you shared with me this amazing playlist of music, and but there's a history here that's worth uncovering and worth talking about.
Well, before we get to that, I want to say that this is actually a nationwide protest. It began several years ago with a long march in Maharashtra. There's farmers' agitations it took place in Rajasthan, in Himachal Pradesh, in Karnataka, across the country. So farmers' agitations have been across the country, and this victory was greeted by farmers everywhere. It just happens that the states that surround Delhi were the only states where farmers could come and sit for long enough period. So that's really the reason why it's Punjabis and people from Haryana and Western Uttar Pradesh and so on that were at the posts. But it is worth remarking, why did the peasantry from Punjab come in such large numbers? It's well worth remarking. A couple of things I think are important. One is that, there is a long history of peasant agitation in that region. There is in all parts of India, but in this region, peasant agitation has a long history. It also has a marked history in India's freedom movement. The great Bhagat Singh, who was, one of the great revolutionaries of the Indian freedom movement, was killed by the British at the age of 23. Really brave soul. His picture was all over at all the farming encampments. I mean, he is a real reference for the farmers, and he's a revolutionary socialist. He was a member of the Hindustan Republican Socialist Army. It's interesting, during the farmer protest, a film came out called about Uddham Singh, who killed a British officer in England, very famous revolutionary, also from Punjab. So there is this history of revolutionary activity which was evoked by the farmers. It's not like there's an unbroken lineage of farmers in Punjab have been protesting over and over. No. But when they did protest, they immediately went back, Nick, and came up with this great history. Pictures of Bhagat Singh, the Uddham Singh, story was there. And in the songs that I had shared with you, the enormous range of songs, there are lots of references to that revolutionary tradition that exists in Punjab among the Sikhs. Sikhs are an interesting community because Sikhism comes in the 16th century as a bringing together of various social traditions in India, particularly traditions of the downtrodden peoples. So in the songs of Sikhism, there's a lot of stuff about don't look at the temple, don't look at the mosque, God is inside you. There's critiques of clerical faiths. Also, Sikhism starts with the enunciation, there's only one God, which is very unusual. It's the kind of monotheistic thing. But in fact, there is no real God. It's not a theism like that. It's an interesting faith. It's about the community. When the last guru died, he said that, look, there'll be no more gurus, there'll be no more leaders of our community, but the book. And they call it the Guru Granth Sahib. They called it the guru or the leader. The book is the thing that's revered. And so there is a sense that the community is important. And I think the Sikh community came out in a completely full way to back this agitation. This greatly disturbed the government of India because Punjab is one of the main recruiting grounds for the Indian military. And when the government started to say these protesters are terrorists, anti-national, whatever, the children of the farmers would come to the protest sites in their uniforms and say, my father is a farmer, I am a serving officer, what is this? That actually rattled the state a lot because this is not what they want to see, is like this anti-government feeling come in their principal recruiting grounds. Plus, there are elections coming up. I mean, I tell you, the real victory here, Nick, apart from the Indian farmers and in fact Indian democracy, the real victory is the idea of mass struggle. There is no substitute for mass struggle to make major gains in a society. You can't make a major gain by writing a bestseller book. Mass struggle is the only antidote to fascism. It's the only antidote to illiberal democratic forces. There's no other way, and the farmers have proved that.
Yeah, and just to kind of pick up on that note, because this is definitely not the end, but I would say, just by reading your work and what Tricontinental has put out, is definitely the beginning of the struggle. So where is the struggle going, and what future of the left in India is there? And what does that look like with these upcoming elections, but also for a project of socialism?
Well, there's two things to say to you. The first is that, India is a very complicated country, 1.4 billion and so on, and it's divided into different states. Many of these states, Nick, if India was like the United States of Europe or the Indian Union or whatever, which in fact it is, it's a federation. Some of these states are the size of a country in anywhere else. I mean, the state of Kerala, for instance, is the size of a medium country in the world. Kerala is governed by a communist government. Well, it's the Left Democratic Front government. During the pandemic, when most people in India, most students could not go to school, 91% of Kerala students went to school. They either went in person or they had digital school. Because the government of Kerala used televisions to do classes. They basically have a government TV channel, and they said, forget entertainment, we're going to use our television system to run classes. And that's what they did. Very brilliant idea, to divide the day into different classes and just broadcast lectures. So that if you don't have a smartphone, which children don't have, if you don't have internet access, now in Kerala there is good internet access, but still, they said it's more democratic to do it like this because television sets are easier to get into people's homes. Anyway, so there are projects. I mean, the project in Kerala is a bona fide project. There is a large communist movement in India, hundreds of millions of people affiliated with the communist struggles. One of the communist parties in India, the Communist Party of India Marxist, has 1 million members. That's a very large membership, not like the Communist Party in China, which has 90 million members, but, still million members. But it's not just that. You see, in this agitation, farmers' agitation, one of the key organizations was the All India Kisan Sabha, which is the Farmers Association, which is basically affiliated with the communist movement. And it played a very key role in putting forward ideas and proposals and strengthening the strategy of the coalition. The struggle was led by a coalition. It was a coalition of about 40 organizations, but the left played a key role. It's very difficult to take mass agitations like this and convert it into election victories. It's very complicated. One should not exaggerate. So what's going to happen is the biggest state in India, Uttar Pradesh, will go into elections next year. Already there is a very good alliance formed between the the Lok Dal, which is mainly strong in western Uttar Pradesh, and the Samajwadi Party, the Socialist Party, which is spread out across the state. They have combined and they will contest against the BJP, the ruling party, and I think they'll make some big inroads. And this is how it's going to go, Nick. Mass agitations will give people confidence. That will give political parties confidence to create electoral platforms and alliances. And then let's defeat, the BJP. I mean, this is a political battle. It's going to take time. But I want to caution people. First, I'd like to say there's no substitute for mass actions. You got to defeat them on the streets. But to convert that into electoral gains, it takes time. It takes effort. You have to fight against bourgeois parties that have a lot of money, that command the attention of the media and so on. Not easy, but necessary. You got to do it. And you can only do it by doing it. You can't do it by anticipating. You got to get out there and do it. Like we're always told in politics that you want to get to your destination, you have to take the first step.
So final question. India joined countries like Venezuela in calling for the repayment of climate debt, or the payment of climate debt. And I just want to maybe have you reflect a little bit about the farmers' protests in the context of climate debt, because there's not only 600 people were killed during this uprising, but that doesn't even, like you said, it's probably a lower number, and the outcome of the economic policies as well as the climate and the change of weather and the extremes that farmers are experiencing. How do you calculate climate debt, but then also how do you get countries like the United States and the NATO countries to pay their historic climate debt? Because as we know that rich people don't just give up their money by choice. So what does that look like in terms of a broader kind of eco-socialist movement?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that the Indian government is a right-wing government. Nonetheless, faced with the fact that it has to somehow deliver something to its own people, it could not roll over and accept the West's position on climate. They can't shut down coal-fired plants and tell people, sorry guys, no electricity now for 1 or 2 generations. There are contradictions. And I think the West, has to anticipate that these contradictions will get deeper. In one of the sessions at COP, I made an intervention. That intervention has gone completely viral all around the world, especially in right-wing WhatsApp groups in India. These far right-wing WhatsApp groups have been sharing it, essentially saying, oh, look, he's a patriot. It's very interesting because, you see, even they have to acknowledge the fact of colonialism, and even they have to acknowledge the fact that this refusal by the West to pay into the climate fund, to assist mitigation and transitions. The West's refusal to pay is just annoying to them as well. Look, the West agreed. It was a number Hillary Clinton came up with. The West agreed to $100 billion a year. And they keep saying every year, we don't have it, we can't do it, sorry. Meanwhile, pandemic struck, okay? Central banks in the West, Nick, came up with $16 trillion. They came up with 16 trillion with a T dollars, okay? Meanwhile, they can't put 100 billion with a B. I mean, it's not credible, right? So, even right-wing elements in places like India look at this and say, this is nonsense. We don't accept it. And that's interesting, because Modi can't just say, United States, whatever you tell me, I'll do. You can't, because there are actual contradictions, which is why, end of the day, at COP, but in other gatherings, India actually has to line up with Venezuela, Cuba, and other countries, sensible countries, to make sensible proposals. That's one. Secondly, there is, even though a right wing is in power in India, there is sufficient numbers of people in India that, for instance, support the Cuban Revolution. India was able to stop full support to the Palestinians and recognize Israel in 1992, after a long period of not recognizing Israel. India, the government was able to do that because they were told you can't have a proper alliance with the US unless you go through Tel Aviv. That's what people in the Ministry of External Affairs told me when I was doing interviews for a book I wrote. They said, we can't get to Washington. You have to go through Tel Aviv. They will not accept the same with Havana. They will not accept voting against the Cuban Revolution. So till today, India joins the rest of the world condemning the blockade, because even though it's a right-wing government. So we have to understand the complexities there. Modi is a right-wing person, is a right-wing government, hideous government. But at COP, they took a reasonable position. They said, we can't just phase out coal. You have to find a better way. And China has an easier road for this, Nick, because Russia has diverted a pipeline. Now it's called Power of Siberia 2, which is going to feed natural gas into China at scale. This was the natural gas supposed to go through Nord Stream 2 into Europe. They are now going to send it to China. Well, India doesn't have access to natural gas. The closest fields are in Iran, the South Pars field in Iran. But that has to go through Pakistan. It's very complicated. So India doesn't have an easy exit from coal. China has an easier exit. So that's why India had to just say, look, we can't do it. You've got to give us a way. Give us funds, help us transition, or give us the technology.
It reminds me, like the whole story with India and even right-wingers in India taking up your speech at COP26 and saying, this guy's a nationalist and a patriot. It reminds me of like Gramsci's like common sense. It's like, yeah, of course, like people in the third world are looking at the global north and being like, y'all are just, you're asking us to subsidize your transition. We're going to pay the cost to it. Like, that's not fair, and I think that's the role of a revolutionary intellectual like yourself, is to take that common sense and turn it into a good sense, to say, this isn't just about, this kind of anti-imperialism of the North, but it's also a socialist project to think, how can this transition benefit the greatest good, the greatest amount of people possible, without sacrificing and making those who are already at the bottom and paying for the climate crisis suffer the most. So I really appreciate that analysis. It's not something that we really entertain here in the North. It's an extremist position or a maximalist position. It's either you're for or against, without really taking into consideration the geopolitics that you just laid out for us, because I think that's really important. And just a final kind of parting shot here. Do you have anything else to add? And what projects are you working on, and where can people find your work?
Well, I would welcome people to go and see the website of thetricontinental.org. Don't forget the before, and then it's Tricontinental. I also want to let you know, Nick, next month, finally, after decades, my selected volume of Ho Chi Minh's writings and speeches will be out, and I'll come and talk with you about that, because firstly, I want to come and talk with you about the cover of it, which I'll tell you about when it's out. It's beautiful. But also, because Ho Chi Minh was one badass guy, and we need to talk about him more.
Amazing. Just to kind of put in a plug, so you're also an editor, or you're the chief editor of Leftward Books, right?
An editor there, yeah.
Yeah, you're editor. But I've been having a hard time finding a place to purchase Leftward Books in the United States, but you can go to 1804 Books. I just bought your amazing interview with Ajaz Ahmad. Nothing human is alien to me. It's an amazing interview. Everyone should go check it out. But also check out 1804 Books. They sell Leftward Books. They sell Vijay's books. They sell some other great titles. But thanks so much, Vijay, for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, best of luck on all of this work. I can't wait to read the Ho Chi Minh collection.
Well, we'll talk about it. Thanks a lot.